Hello and welcome everyone. It's a very cold evening here in Oxford, but I am delighted to be offering on behalf of the Refugee Study Centre a very warm welcome to Dr. J. Ramasubramanyam, Assistant Professor in the Law and Society Programme at York University, Toronto. Jay's career spans legal practice and academia. He's worked for the UNHCR as a Refugee Status Determination Associate and for the International Committee of the Red Cross as a Protection Field Officer. Having received his Ph.D. from Carleton University earlier this year, Jay has quickly established himself as a legal scholar engaged in producing research on international refugee law that's of the highest academic standard. He's published in the Asian Yearbook of International Law and contributed 2 chapters to the prestigious, but I have to say, extremely heavy Oxford Handbook of International Refugee Law. Jay's research interests include third world approaches to international law and post-colonial theory. He's interested in exploring asymmetries of power, including in knowledge production, and is currently working on a piece that explores post-colonial paradoxes in the labeling of refugees and migrants. In this seminar, Jay is going to speak for about 30 minutes on subcontinental defiance to the global refugee regime, global leadership, or regional exceptionalism. As always, you can ask questions by posting them in the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can also email them to me directly. My name's Catherine Briddick. Thank you very much, Jay, for joining us, and over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very, very much for this wonderful invitation. And thank you very much, Catherine, for inviting me to present this public seminar. The topic, as was mentioned, is subcontinental defiance to the global refugee regime. The study of contemporary refugee rights has mostly revolved around increasing its relevance to Eurocentric institutional mechanisms that were constructed after the Second World War. Therefore, researching refugee law has remained preoccupied with integrating discourses of Eurocentrism more coherently into other contexts and regions of the world. So I begin today's talk with the premise that refugee studies literature has predominantly reflected a Eurocentric gaze, which fails to capture the unique nature of forced displacement in contexts like the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, in order to demonstrate the importance of understanding forced displacement in South Asia, I'll present a few thoughts on India's engagement with the global refugee regime. I must admit that this talk is a very, very small part of a very long doctoral research that spanned for over 6 years and includes insights rooted in third world approaches to international law, postcolonial theory, subcontinental geopolitics, and critical race theory. What I plan to do today is to provide a quick overview of India's engagement with international refugee law mechanisms. A detailed overview of India's engagement with the League of Nations is, of course, outside the scope of this particular talk. However, it is significant to highlight India's willingness to cooperate with the arrangements to protect refugees in the early years of the interwar period. These arrangements took the form of issuing refugees with identification and travel documents with the international acceptance known as the non-sent passport. India's role in participating in such arrangements of refugee protection cannot be understated, as much of its refugee protection practice grew out of responding to forced displacement from Europe. This particular issue became a point of contention in later years during the formalization process of the 1951 Convention, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The League of Nations Governmental Conference on Identity Papers for Russian Refugees proposed an arrangement that was concluded on July 5th, 1922. In response to this, the Secretary of State for India sent a letter to the Secretary General of the League of Nations, informing him of India's willingness and plan to furnish identity certificates to Russian refugees. Subsequently, the displacement of Armenian refugees resulted in the extension of the 1922 arrangement to Armenians as well. India was among the 23 states that signed the 1926 arrangement relating to the issue of identity certificates to Russian and Armenian refugees. While there is limited information available on the efforts specifically undertaken by the government of India with respect to protecting refugee groups during this time, documents indicate India's cooperation with refugee protection arrangements and also its reluctance to deport those who were residing in its territory. Throughout the 1930s, India continued to abide by the obligations outlined in the various refugee protection arrangements that were established under the League of Nations. Even prior to the establishment of contemporary refugee protection frameworks, India was a willing participant to providing sanctuary to many who were fleeing atrocities in Europe, and its role in refugee protection has been consistent, despite being characterized as an outlier in international refugee law practice. Despite the tentativeness of British authorities, the government of India undertook initiatives to provide sanctuary to protect Jewish and Polish refugees during this time. For instance, in a letter to Edward Linley Wood, who was a former Viceroy of India in 1939, an Indian civil servant, Badri Prasad Mittal, had outlined a plan to establish a Jewish colony in the suburbs of Delhi and other parts of North India to aid those who were expelled from Germany. The plan also outlined the allocation of 4 million square yards of land in the suburbs of Delhi to establish a colony to house Jewish refugees. One of the most critical elements that this letter indicates of this proposal was that this is a purely Indian enterprise. Additionally, 6 million square yards of land was also allocated to set up factories, workshops, and mills to accommodate Jewish refugees' career prospects. One other critical moment of humanitarian effort was undertaken by the government of India in protecting Polish refugees. This was detailed in a report that was published in 1943. Pejoratively characterized as a Polish invasion of India, this report details the arrangements that were made for several thousand Polish refugees by Maharaja Jam Sahib, who you can see in this picture. The Maharaja was a ruling prince of the Western Indian kingdom of Navnagar. India had agreed to receive several thousand Polish refugee children who had been orphaned during the typhus epidemic that spread during the Second World War in East Africa. India had set up camps across Western India, and there were translation services, educational facilities, and healthcare facilities that were available to these refugees as well. Now, it is noteworthy that all these camps were not built by the British government, but were situated on sites that were loaned by the rulers of Indian states like the Jam Sahib. The context under which the camps were operating is also very important to consider. Not only was India still firmly under British control, but around the same time, the Bengal famine had gripped Eastern India. A series of deliberate policy failures and apathy towards the Indian population at the hands of the British imperialists was unsurprisingly the cause for the famine. As Amartya Sen argues, the evidence points to sheer neglect from His Majesty's government, which inflicted grave harm on India's population. With over 2 million people estimated to have perished during this famine, one of the viceroys of India had gone on record to declare that the famine was the result of the new way of vital problems of India being treated with neglect, hostility, and contempt. So during this time, it is important to recognize that India's refugee protection practice grew out of its role in accommodating thousands of wartime European refugees, while simultaneously being at the end of oppressive colonial policies. The founding of the right to asylum was entirely centered around the European political landscape and disenfranchisement of Europeans. This has provided a conveniently myopic narrative that negates the experiences of forced migrants in the global South, and more specifically, the subcontinent. The analysis of forced displacement in the subcontinent will not be complete without a clear contextualization of nation states that were built in the region. with the 1947 partition of India marking the moment of geopolitical reorganization, examining the issues associated with the paramountcy of nation state in international law becomes all the more significant in the context of this particular talk. It has been well established that colonial boundary making in the subcontinent has had impacts on populations and identity. Scholars like Zollberg argue that one of the most prominent factors under which persecution emerged is through the transformation of empires into nation states. In the case of the partition of India, this process of transformation was imposed and forced. As Wazira Zamindar notes, this long partition entailed the division, categorization, and regulation of people, places, and institutions from which emerged the undefined, the stateless, and a landscape of divided families. In the throes of the crisis that emerged from the partition of India, denationalization also became an integral part of capturing the essence of this newly found independence from colonialism. However, the disorderly nature of colonial boundary making, coupled with the ambiguities associated with the identity of those who were displaced, also underscores the failure of the system of nation states in the subcontinent. Displacement, division, and categorization along ethno-religious lines became the markers of the contingent conditions that led to the disorderliness associated with the drawing of an international boundary in the subcontinent. Hidden in these realities are the interconnected legal, social, and political struggles for clarity on how colonial inquisition, invasion, and subsequent state-making along Eurocentric lines can be a form of persecution. This is something that has never been accounted for in refugee protection norms. Conventional historiographies also omit the role regions like the subcontinent played in the development of the Refugee Convention. While states in the region may not be signatories to the convention or the protocol, it is significant to note that the resistance presented by newly independent states during the formalization process of the convention provided grounds to understand its loose institutionalization, its Eurocentric approach, and its inability to account for displacement induced as a result of colonialism. After the formal end to colonialism in South Asia in 1947, India and Pakistan attempted to constructively interact with the international community to establish a robust, legally binding refugee protection framework. Both states arrived at the United Nations on the heels of widespread violence and displacement resulting from the partition. However, by the time the final stages of the formalization process of the convention began, both India and Pakistan had withdrawn their representation. The newly created borders between India and Pakistan were not only fluid in nature, but also placed arbitrary characterizations of identity and nationhood. The discussions also had an inherent and implicit capacity to impose a Eurocentric gaze on subcontinental populations, which were dehumanized for centuries prior to this moment in history. The language of the convention also did not adequately capture the forcefulness of borders in the region and erase the subjective experiences of those who had felt the impacts of the partition. The unwillingness to include these circumstances of those who were being displaced within South Asia during the partition resulted in a regional disillusionment with regards to the convention and the mandate of the UNHCR. The international community's preoccupation with post-Second World War displacement in Europe was based on the argument that displacement in South Asia was not a refugee crisis, but was instead an exchange of populations. The implication was that those who were relocated across newly created international borders in South Asia did not in effect lose their citizenship like those who were displaced after the Second World War. This led to the belief by Western observers that those who were relocated across newly created international borders would enjoy the protection of new governments that were being instituted and did not require international protection. Such an observation is inaccurate. The creation of new territorial entities under the guise of decolonization was not only an effort to erase complex subcontinental identities and homogenize populations, but also manifested in massive displacement. This frame was never included in the discussions during the formalization process of the convention. The core objectives of international law are therefore built on constrained notions of international protection. In meetings throughout the formalization process, both India and Pakistan had attempted to draw attention to the millions of partition refugees. The delegate from Pakistan in 1949 outlined that the definition of the term refugee should be revised and pointed out that in its current form, it only applied to victims of events that occurred in Europe. Given that both India and Pakistan had been compelled to receive in the excess of over 7 million refugees coming from various parts of the subcontinent, a more far-reaching approach to refugeehood was ideal. The Indian delegate at the same time also said that India had done its utmost to assist over 6,000 European refugees to settle in its territory after the Second World War. India's position throughout the formalization process of the convention and the establishment of UNHCR was quite consistent. While demonstrating their cooperation to an international legal instrument's purpose, they also wanted their concerns to be heard. It had also become evident that India was committed to its humanitarian responsibilities towards protecting refugees. However, India's representatives drew attention to the fact that despite the formalization process including several references to displacement in the subcontinent, no efforts were made to include the concerns in the convention's core precepts. Many representatives from the subcontinent, both India and Pakistan, argued that many refugees from Europe had been resettled to countries like Australia and Canada purely because they happened to be Europeans. However, no funds or international aid had been requested for the millions of refugees in India and Pakistan. It was based on the idea that UN had to help all afflicted people everywhere, as suffering knew no racial or political boundaries. There was a great deal of repudiation of the international community that the United Nations was attempting to install a partial remedy which involved discrimination and marginalization of Global South peoples. Therefore, it is significant to analyze the origins of subcontinental defiance that arose from the concerns that were presented by representatives during the formalization process of the convention. Having said that, the resistance shown by India to ratify the convention is not reflective of its practice. Until recently, India had adhered to overall objectives of international refugee law without explicit accession to refugee law instruments. For instance, soon after the arrival of the Dalai Lama in 1959, India formally granted, asylum to any Tibetan who was fleeing violence. This policy was initially a response to public opinion and a feeling of kinship, but subsequently was done in line with international norms. India had also established the Central Relief Committee for Tibetan refugees in order to provide assistance to them. As a part of their initial efforts, the Indian government had set up transit camps in the border states and subsequently afforded permanent settlement to Tibetans in other regions. The new government at that time had committed to building refugee protection systems of its own. However, the narrative presented by the international community was not particularly flattering. On September 4th, 1959, an inter-office memorandum read that these refugees are living under very miserable circumstances, and it appears that the directives given from the central government in New Delhi are not applied in a satisfactory way. In response to this, on September 7th, 1959, the Indian government ran a press article that India will not seek the help of UNHCR in resettling 12,000 Tibetan refugees. While the Tibetan refugee movements were still ongoing, disturbances in East Pakistan began to create massive refugee movements into India. A conference and rehabilitation of migrants was held in New Delhi in 1964, And it was agreed that every effort would be made to rehabilitate people who had come to India. Further, the upper house of the Indian Parliament also debated the situation of East Pakistan refugees. In light of the recent exodus of East Pakistan, stressed the government that this was a human problem that should be tackled on a non-partisan basis without international intervention. India's non-signatory stance was evident in its systematic rejection of international aid for refugees. The Indo-Pakistan War of 1971 and the ensuing displacement of 9.5 million people from East Pakistan were enduring manifestations of post-colonial nation building and the politics of newfound nationalism. India's position on ensuring the provision of relief for refugees reinforced the idea that refugees were a matter of bilateral, not multilateral relations, and that international agreements could constrict their freedom of action. These are just a couple of examples that I have provided in order to illustrate India's refugee protection practice. Of course, India's engagement with refugee protection has been long and has lasted for decades. But let's fast forward to something a little more recent. So the final strand of this talk will explore India's more recent engagement with international refugee law. Having examined India's engagement with the Convention and the UNHCR, I wanted to highlight some of the more recent interactions with international refugee law, specifically impacting domestic refugee policy. So among the most recent developments in international refugee law is the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees in December 2018. This was done with the support of many UN member states, including India. The Global Compact on Refugees begins with the words that the predicament of refugees is a common concern of mankind. However, though not legally binding, it claims to represent the political will and ambition of the international community as a whole for strengthened cooperation and solidarity with refugees. Now, the GCR is an earnest attempt at increasing the levels of international cooperation with respect to refugee protection. However, much like the 1951 Convention's formalization, the Global Compact also fails to make references to the role of Western intervention in increased refugee flows. As Chimney notes, though this may not be true of all refugee movements, as Rohingya refugees are on the move due to ongoing ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, the GCR is silent on the role of external actors in the production of refugees. However, the GCR also notes that addressing root causes is the responsibility of countries at the origin of refugee movements. Historicizing Rohingya refugee movements also points to the recklessness of the formal end to colonialism. As Muhammad Shahabuddin argues, as the example of the Rohingya crisis reveals, what seemed to be a solution at the time of decolonization of Myanmar turned out to be a recipe for humanitarian catastrophe, as the post-colonial nation building process had effectively failed. Aside from the Rohingya refugee crisis, Chimney also contends that major refugee outflows from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria have also been the result of armed Western intervention. As with the 1951 Convention, the GCR also fails to clearly account for the unique nature of displacement of states in the Global South, specifically the subcontinent. Though Section 2.3 of the GCR contains 3 paragraphs on regional and sub-regional approaches, it homogenizes their role in advancing refugee protection. The text mentions that the characteristics of regional and sub-regional mechanisms and groupings vary, but would play an important role in comprehensive responses. However, these comprehensive responses center the role of UNHCR as opposed to allowing for a dynamic ad hoc regional mechanism to coexist independent of international intervention. So the GCR is of very little consequence to India's existing approach to refugee protection. Though India has been generous in the past by hosting refugees, in recent years, there has been a change in tone. In August 2017, the government of India directed authorities to identify illegal immigrants, including Rohingya refugees, and commence deportation procedures. a writ petition was filed in the Supreme Court of India to prevent the forced return of Rohingya. Almost 4 years later, on April 8, 2021, the Supreme Court of India issued an order rejecting Rohingya refugees' right to non-refoulement. In rejecting the petitioner's plea, the court ordered that since India is not a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees in 1951, or the Protocol of the year 1967, the principle of non-refoulement is inapplicable. The court referenced national security ramifications and considered the arrival of refugees as a continuous threat of influx of illegal immigrants. This policy decision, coupled with the judgment on the writ petition, has emerged in light of India's anti-Muslim sentiments and attempts to redefine citizenship along religious lines. Here are some of the concluding thoughts. Now, this may not pertain directly to what I was talking about earlier, but I felt that this was most appropriate to highlight. Mainstream literature on refugee law and refugee studies have continued to follow the contours of Eurocentric norms and institutions of forced displacement. They have failed to adequately include perspectives from the global South. Though there has been some critical literature in the field, it is still very sparse. In fact, some of the more recent critical interventions in refugee studies have also been undertaken by scholars in the global North. My attempt is not to disparage the work of these scholars. However, I am a little bit perturbed by the absence of voices from critical scholars of the global South. And this is not for our lack of trying, but due to the entrenched asymmetry in knowledge production and the privileging of certain voices within the domain of refugee studies. Refugee studies scholarship, both mainstream and critical, continues to remain within the exclusive realm of scholars in the global North. While I also possess this privilege of working from the global North on a project concerning the global South, my objective is to create inroads into refugee studies literature as an early career scholar who is originally from the subcontinent. The transnational impact of my inability to carry out this research in the global South can also be captured by A. Sivanandan's words, "We are here because you were there." Centuries of colonialism not only eroded subcontinental identities, but has also disabled me from imagining them devoid of such oppressive forces. Contrary to the assumption that international refugee law contains within it the true elements of emancipatory forces, I've argued that the creation of international refugee law is implicated in its inherently hierarchical and racist positioning of those displaced in the global South. Thank you.